Hello and welcome to amarman.com YouTube channel. And in this video, we will discuss about object-oriented ABAP local class. So if you are beginner to object-oriented ABAP programming, or if you want to learn about how to code a local class in an object-oriented program, then this is the right video for you. And in this video, we will discuss some of the topics such as basically related to local class. So the primary focus over here is on ABAP local class, and we will discuss how to define ABAP local class, how to implement ABAP local class. Then we will also see some of the examples related to ABAP local class programming. Also, we will see visibility section within a local class and components of the class. So let's get started. So first thing is we know that there are two flavors of class in object-oriented ABAP programming. That is, we can create a local class or we can create a global class. So how do we create a local class? That is, how do you define an ABAP local class? So for this, first thing that we will see is the definition of the class. So we can define an ABAP local class by using class and class name and definition, and it will end with end class. All right. So this is the syntax of defining a ABAP local class. Fine. Now inside this class, obviously we will create components. So we can have components of the class. Now what are the components of a class? Inside a class we can place an attribute or attributes, methods, events, constant, types, and interfaces. So these could be the components of a class. Now, whenever you define a class, then post definition, you might have to implement the class. So what is the syntax to implement the class? Basically, you use the statement class followed by the class name and implementation, and then you use end class. And inside this class and class implementation end class, you will implement all the methods of the class. So basically, class implementation is required only when we have methods defined inside the class definition. If we don't have any methods defined in the class definition, then no class implementation is required. So is class implementation mandatory? Actually, the answer is no. Class implementation is not mandatory, but class implementation is mandatory if you have a method defined in the class. So what do you do inside class implementation? You implement the methods that you have defined inside the class. So all the methods that you have defined inside the class should be implemented in class implementation. Class implementation holds only the implementation of the methods and nothing else. So we just discussed about the definition of the class and the implementation of the class. So we are talking about local class. Now switch to ABAP editor and create a class definition. Okay, so I will be changing one of the existing programs. So let us change this program. So this is a ABAP editor, a new ABAP program. And in this program, first thing is we will try to define a class. So we use the keyword class name. So generally we do a nomenclature of the local class as LCL. So LCL is always prefixed when you're creating a local class. So we will say like class LCL. and you can give some name to it, but let's say we give one. All right. So class name and then definition, and this will end with end class. So this is an empty class. We haven't defined any components inside this class. And if we check, there is no errors. Next, we would like to define some components inside the class. And as we know, we can define attributes, methods, events, interfaces. These are going to be the components of the class. So let us define an attribute. So let's say I define an attribute called as local variable 1 and type integer. Okay. And I will define another one, local variable 2 type integer. And let's define a third one, local variable 3 type integer. So I've defined three attributes over here. Attributes that we define inside class definition when we create an object of the class, that is when we create an instance of the class. At that time, these attributes will get memory allocation, right? So at the class definition, we don't get any memory allocation for instance attributes, and these are instance attributes, right? So we have defined three attributes over here. So let's save this and check it, and we see a error over here, that is there is no public, protected or private section defined. So with this, we will try to understand the next topic or the next information, that is you must define visibility section inside the local class. Fine. So what are the visibility sections that is possible inside a local class? We can create a class can have a public section, a protected section, and a private section. So these are the three sections that you can define inside a class. Is it mandatory to define all these three sections? Answer is no. And you can just define a section based on your requirement, but it is mandatory to have at least one visibility section. So every component that you place inside a class must belong to any one of the visibility sections. Okay. So one more point is that ABAP class does not have a default visibility for its components. So it is mandatory to define a visibility section, right? That is the reason we got an error, because by default we don't have any visibility section in a ABAP local class, and we must define a visibility section. At least one visibility section should be defined, and every component of the class should belong to any one of the visibility sections. So there are three sections: public section, private section, and protected section. So these are the three sections. So let us understand what is a public section. Now, the components under public section can be accessed from within the class as well as from outside the class. So basically, whatever components you place inside the public section, they are like public and can be accessed from anywhere, right? The public section or the components of the public section is also termed as the interface of the class, with which basically means that we communicate with the class with the components that we have defined inside the public section. So generally, what do we define inside the public section? Generally, we define the methods inside the public section, because uh, going with the concept of object-oriented programming, we would like to encapsulate or hide the data, right? And since we want to hide the data, we will not put it inside the public section. We generally put it inside the private section, and we always access the data using some methods. So those methods should be part of the public section so that we can call those methods from outside the program. So that is the whole, in simple words, the simple concept of having a uh, public section. All right. So if we talk about what is a private section, now components under the private section are accessible from within the class only, right? So that is the key point here, that these components will be accessed from within the class only. So you cannot access it from outside the class. And the third is protected section. Inside a protected section, the components under the protected section can be accessed from within the class as well as by a child class. Fine. So we know that object-oriented programming supports inheritance. So the concept of protected section is that if there is a component, or let's say an attribute, that you don't want to get it accessed from outside the class, but you would like the child class to access that component or that attribute. So those kind of attributes you will define inside the private section. So point is very simple. Think about it. For example, let's say you have defined an attribute and you place it inside the public section. So that attribute will become visible from outside the class. If you define the attribute inside the private section, then that attribute is visible only from within the class, right? Even the child class cannot access the private section attribute. So the only way with which you can give an attribute access to an attribute uh, for the child class is by defining it inside the protected section. So that is the whole concept of protected section. So let us now switch back to the ABAP editor and see what we can define here. So for example, as I just mentioned, technically you should keep the attributes inside the private section. So I will define a private section over here. So if I save my program and check it, I don't see any errors. Now, once I have defined these attributes under the private section, obviously I will not be able to access these attributes from outside the class. So let us test this scenario. So for example, I may, let's write here start of selection and create an object. Later down the line, we will discuss about object creation also, but let's have a look into this. So I'm creating an object using type ref2 followed by the class name. So this is LCL1, and then I use create object and then create object, and then let us call the variable lv1. So for example, let's say we write here, write local object lv1. So we use the arrow operator to call the components of the class from the object. So whenever you are using an object, you must use the arrow operator to call the components of the class, whether it is a attribute, whether it is a method. Whenever you are using an object, you must use the arrow operator. So in this case, we are trying to access lv1, which actually belongs to the private section from outside the class. So by creating an object, we are basically creating an instance of the class, and we would like to access the private section of the class. So is it possible? Let's check this. So we get an error there that access to private attribute is not allowed. So we cannot access the components of the private section from outside the class. Okay. Now we have understood about the visibility of class components. Then over here, I am defining or explaining what are the, attributes that you can declare. So obviously inside the class definition, you can have various types of attributes. You can even define types and constants. All right. Then next is, in order to do some or provide some functionality, you will have to define methods, right? So methods This is the syntax to define the methods, that is methods followed by method name, and then you can have importing, exporting, changing, returning. These are the parameters that the method supports. Fine. So we will define a method, and then we will use the method. Basically, we define the method inside the public section, and we use that method to access the attributes which is generally defined inside the private section of the class. Fine. So let us try to define a method in our example. So we will second create a public section, for example. So I write here public section. Now if I just define this and if I check it, we get an error there. Now the error tells us very clearly that the public section should be first, then we should have the protected section, and then the private section. So this is the order that should be followed when defining the visibility inside the local class. So let us place this public section right at the top. So now we have the correct order of the visibility sections. And if I save and check this work, so it says that private attribute LV1 is not allowed. So obviously we will delete this. Okay. Now it is good. We have the correct order of the sections, visibility section. Now inside this section, we would like to define some methods. So for example, I say methods, and then first thing is that I would like to set some value to my attributes. So I can say like set value, and so this is my method name. Set value is basically my method name. So methods followed by method name, and then if you follow the syntax, then you can define the parameters of the method. So let us define the parameters of the method. We will have an importing parameter or two importing parameters over here. So let's say I mention it as importing one type integer, and then the second importing parameter type integer. So this is my method definition. How does it look like? So if I check, now we get a statement there that if you have defined a method, class definition does not have a class implementation. So basically, whenever you have a method, it is mandatory to have class implementation. If we don't have a method, then class implementation is not mandatory. Okay, so next thing is we would like to have the class implementation, and as you know that this is the syntax to have the or define the class implementation. So let us say here, like for example, class name implementation followed by end class. So if I write like this and save it and check it, then we get another message over there, syntax error, that implementation missing for the method set value. Right? So we have defined this method, but we haven't implemented the method. So we must implement the method. As you know that inside the class implementation, you do implementation of the methods that you have defined in the class definition. So let us do the implementation of the method. So I say here method followed by the method name and end method. So if I write this much and save and check my work, this looks good, right? Now, so what we would like to do here in this implementation part of this set value method, obviously we will be having these two importing parameters, and we would like to feed in this two importing parameters into our LV1 and LV2 attributes. So we can say like LV1 is equal to IM1 and LV2 is equal to IM2. Now, one point that you can notice over here is that when we are calling a component of the class from within the method, then we don't need any reference as such. So basically, by default, we have a self reference over here called as the me keyword. And with the me keyword, the system understands that we are referring to the instance, to the same instance to which the implementation belongs. So we don't really have to add the me keyword, but by default, the system understands that we are referring to the same instance, and so it will try to access the attributes from the same instance of the class. All right. So we have LV1 and LV2, and that we are equating over here. So with this, we are setting the values of the attributes LV and LV2, which are basically private section attributes, which can be accessed by a method of the class which belongs to the public section, because within the class you can, or from inside the class you can access any section, components of the any section of the class. Okay, so let us define one more method over here called as add. So we say like add value. Does it require any importing parameter? It doesn't require any importing parameter, and we will just add the value and we will display it. So we can keep it like add value. Then if you have two methods inside the class and you have defined one of the method and not defined the other method, sorry, you have implemented one of the method and have not implemented another method, then is it possible? So it says that implementation missing for method add value. So it's not possible. How many methods that you have defined inside the class definition, you will have to implement those many methods inside the class implementation. So let us say like method add value. This will end with end method, and over here we mention like lv3 is equal to lv1 plus lv2. Okay, and for example we can even use the write statement. So we can say like lv1 comma, and let us place, so lv1 and then lv2, is equal to lv3. So we would like to add the value as well as display it. This is what we are doing in add value method. Okay, so this looks good. So we just learned how you can define the method and how you can implement the method inside a local class, right? So we discussed about visibility sections, then we are discussing about methods, implementation, definition and implementation in a local class. Now, here I have already used the object. So let us try to understand this. How do you create an object? What is the syntax to create objects? So basically, objects are instances of the class, right? So they get a unique memory allocation. Whenever you create an object that is based on a class definition, you will get a unique memory allocation. So this is basically something like this. Like for example, if I have a class, so for example, this is my class LCL1. So this is the class that I defined there. And inside this class definition, I place some attributes and I place some methods. So for example, LV1, LV2, LV3, these are the methods that I placed there. Now, this is the class definition. All right. So class definition is like types, and class definition does not occupy memory, or no memory allocation is done for class definition. Fine. So you have defined the class, but memory is not allocated. No memory allocation is done for class definition. But then when you create an object with this class, then memory is allocated. So memory is allocated, for example, for LV1, LV2, and LV3. So this is your create object. And basically what happens here, memory allocation happens. All right. Now just one more point to understand is that later you will learn about static components. So at this point of time, I have just declared instance components. So there is no memory allocation done in class definition for instance components, but memory allocation is done for constants and static components in the class definition itself. So for example, but if you have static attributes or constants, memory allocation is done in the class definition itself. So we will understand about static attributes and constants in a different video, but over here you just understand that since we have created instance attributes, so no memory allocation is done for when class is defined. But when you create the object, memory allocation happens. Now, if you come back here, what is the syntax to create objects? First is that an object is basically an instance of the class. So we know that class definition is a blueprint, and we create an instance of the class which is known as object. We can create any number of objects for the class. Now, how do you create an object? Object creation is basically a two-step process. That is, you will use, first you will declare a reference variable using data type ref2. So this is basically creating a reference variable using the class name. So that is what I have done here. If you come back, data, then object name, type ref2, class name. So this is basically your object reference, or yeah. So this is basically object reference. Then once you have referred the class, then the next is that you can instantiate and get the object. So basically, how do you do instantiation? You use the statement create object followed by the object name to instantiate, to actually do the memory allocation. So that is the statement create object. So this basically instantiates the class. Fine. So with this statement, basically memory allocation happens. And another thing that happens is that so this is basically a memory allocation. Think of it that this is actually a memory allocation. So let me use a different color. So this is basically your memory allocation. And then the object name that you just created, it is basically referring to this memory allocation. All right. So the object name is basically referring to this memory allocation, right? So whenever you have to access this memory allocation, you will use the object name. So that is the whole concept. This is what is known as instantiation of the class. So we are creating an instance of the class. Class instance will have its own unique memory allocation. Okay. So this is the instance of the class, and you can create as many instances of the class as is possible. So there is no restriction for the number of instances that you can create for a class. So if I create another instance of the class, for example, all right, then another memory allocation will happen. Now, since we have instance attributes in our class definition, we have instance attributes. So a separate memory allocation will be done for all these instance attributes. So now we get another separate memory allocation when we create the next object, right? Now we can handle these two objects individually because they are separate memory allocations, right? And so for example, here I can feed in the value of like for example 10. Here I can feed the value of this attribute as 12 and we can compute. And in this case, we can feed in the value of 21. For example, here we can feed in the value of 22 and compute because these are two separate memory allocations. And this happens because we have, when we use the statement create object, then separate memory allocation happens for the object. Okay, so now you have understood this is the class definition and this is the instance of the class. You can have any number of instances of the class, and by creating an instance of the class, you basically create memory allocation. Okay, and then you use the reference variable to refer that memory allocation. Okay, so if I come back to our example, we have used this statement data reference name type ref2 now, and we have used create object. One more thing that you need to understand here is that we will always use the create object statement after start of selection event. Mandatorily, we have to mention the start of selection event. Now, the reason for that is, like for example, in this case, if I comment the start of selection and check the work, we get an error there that statement is not accessible. So this create object LO statement is not accessible. The reason for that is that we have implemented the class over here, right? And basically the program or the runtime environment understands that the class implementation is the end of your program. Fine. So for example, when we create a subroutine, so we define the subroutine, but we implement the subroutine at the end of our program, right? And basically the compiler understands that when it meets the implementation of the subroutine, it basically understands that that is the end of the program. So here also uh, the ABAP runtime environment understands that this is the end of the program. But just to make the runtime environment understand that, okay, you start the execution of the program from here, we must use the start of selection because after this implementation, all the statements will be ignored. Fine. So when we use start of selection event, we indicate the runtime environment that you start the execution of the program from here. All right. So that is the reason we need start of selection mentioned in ABAP programming. All right. And then next, what is the syntax to call attributes, instance attributes and instance methods? Basically, we follow the object reference followed by the arrow operator followed by the name of the component. So here also we will use the same technique. So for example, I mentioned here local object, and the first thing that I would like to do here is set value to this method. So what you should do here, you can use call method, but this is optional. So for example, I can use call method, but this is optional, right? And I can directly use LO followed by arrow operator and the method name. So call method is basically optional. Use control space to get all the methods that you have defined and then use shift enter. So it will basically take care of all the parameters that you have defined inside that method. So I have two importing parameters. So I will pass values to these importing parameters. So for example, here, let's say I pass in 10 and in this one, let's say I pass 11. Okay. So if I save it, check it, it's good, no problem. And then I would like to display this addition. So for example, I will say add value, and this is how you can call the method, add value method. It doesn't have any parameter. So if I save and check it, no problem. Let's activate and see the output. So we see this output 10 plus 11 is equal to 21. Absolutely correct, right? So this is how we have defined the object. Now, for example, if I want to create another instance, another memory allocation, then again we will create an object reference. So let's say object reference to type ref2 lcl1, and then let us copy this code. So this is create object lo2, and then let's copy this code. So these are separate memory allocations, obviously. So they will have their own space to hold the data. And in this case, let's pass in 21. And here, let me pass in 22. Let's take this as lo2. So now if I save and check my work, good, activated and executed, and we see the answer. But did you notice, we have done some mistake here. So let us see. This is the mistake. So let's make it hello, and let's make it back to lo2. Save, check, activate, and execute. Now this looks good, right? So we just learned about how do you define a class. That is, how do you write code for a local class? How do you write methods inside the class? How do you define the visibility sections? How do you create access attributes inside the sections? How do you implement the methods? And how do you create the objects as well as access the methods or attributes that you have defined inside the class? So that's all in this video. Thank you for watching. If you like this video, then please subscribe and hit the bell icon.